the red carpet, the flashbulbs. The gowns were chosen weeks in advance. That is the Hollywood you were shown. But on the opening nights of some of the greatest films ever made, the stars who created them were banned from the building, and the reasons why will change the way you see every film you have ever loved. Grace Kelly, the star they couldn't keep. She had won the Oscar. She had starred in 4 consecutive Alfred Hitchcock masterworks. Fan magazines called her the closest thing to perfection Hollywood had ever produced. And in the spring of 1956, Grace Kelly was precisely where every studio executive wanted their most prized possession to be at the peak of her powers, with years of profitable films ahead of her. Then she met Prince Rainier III of Monaco, and everything MGM believed it owned began to slip through its fingers. MGM's fury was immediate and thoroughly documented. Studio executives viewed her departure as professional abandonment, a betrayal of the unspoken compact between a star and the institution that had elevated her. Kelly had not asked permission. She had not consulted the studio's publicity department, her contract's morality clause, or the carefully constructed mythology built around her name. She had simply fallen in love, and in doing so, had committed what the studio system considered the most unforgivable sin available to a contracted star. She had made a decision about her own life. What followed was quieter than a dramatic confrontation, and in many ways more devastating. The invitations to industry events that had once arrived without question stopped arriving. Her place within the studio's social infrastructure, the screenings, the celebrations, the premiere circuits that had defined her professional life, became contingent on a goodwill she no longer possessed. The woman who had taken home the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1955 for The Country Girl found, within months, that the doors of the institution she had graced were closing around her one by one. Not with a dramatic slam, with the quiet, precise efficiency that the studio system had perfected over decades. There was a particular conversation that captured the studio's position with devastating clarity. MGM head Dor Sherry reportedly told Kelly directly that the studio had invested years and considerable resources in building her into what she had become, and that walking away to marry a European prince was, in his estimation, an act of professional ingratitude that the studio would not be obligated to overlook. Kelly, by all accounts, listened calmly and left for Monaco anyway. The studio's investment in her image had not, it turned out, purchased her future. What made the situation more complicated was that Kelly herself was genuinely conflicted. Those in her inner circle during the months before her departure described a woman who was not simply escaping Hollywood, but genuinely torn between 2 versions of her life, the actress she was becoming and the woman she also wanted to be. She had read the script for Designing Woman and found it promising. She had preliminary conversations about a possible film with director George Stevens. These were not the actions of someone eager to leave. They were the actions of someone who believed, wrongly as it turned out, that she might be permitted to have both. Kelly left for Monaco in April of 1956. She married Prince Rainier in a ceremony the entire world watched. She became Her Serene Highness, Princess Grace of Monaco, and she never returned to Hollywood as an actress. What the studio intended as punishment, the world received as a fairy tale. But those closest to Princess Grace described a woman who genuinely mourned her work. She missed acting. She missed the specific satisfaction of a performance achieved, a scene completed, a character fully realized. The palace was magnificent, the prince was devoted, and none of it filled the particular space that the craft had occupied. In later years, she made quiet attempts to negotiate a return to the screen, a project here, a collaboration there, each one blocked or complicated by the competing demands of royal protocol and a Hollywood establishment that had moved on without her. Alfred Hitchcock, who had directed her in 3 films and understood her talent better than almost anyone, wanted to cast her in Marnie in 1964. Monaco's royal family objected. The public protested the idea of their princess returning to play a troubled thief. The project was given to Tippi Hedren instead. The door Grace Kelly had walked through in 1956 never fully opened again. She had given MGM everything they asked for: the roles, the publicity, the carefully managed persona, the complete subordination of her private self to their commercial requirements. When she asked for the one thing she wanted in return, the freedom to choose her own future, the studio made clear that no such arrangement had ever been on offer. Grace Kelly gave Hollywood everything it wanted from her. Hollywood gave her a kingdom and quietly ensured she stayed in it. She was not the last star to discover that ownership and affection were not the same thing. Ingrid Bergman denounced from the Senate floor. If Grace Kelly's exclusion came through institutional silence, what happened to Ingrid Bergman came through the loudest possible channels, beginning not in a studio executive's office, but on the floor of the United States Senate. In the 1940s, Bergman was not merely a movie star. She was a moral figure, the embodiment, for millions of admirers, of feminine virtue and spiritual grace. She had played a nun in The Bells of St. Mary's, the selfless Ilsa in Casablanca, Joan of Arc on both stage and screen. Audiences did not simply admire her, they trusted her in a way that extended beyond the cinema into something closer to reverence. She received more fan mail than any other actress at her studio during the mid-1940s, letters not just from admirers, but from people who wrote to her as though she were a personal friend, a moral compass, someone they could trust with their own troubles, because she so clearly embodied goodness on screen. Then, in 1949, she traveled to Italy to work with director Roberto Rossellini on Stromboli, and she fell completely, irreversibly in love with him. Both Bergman and Rossellini were married to other people. What was unusual was that the truth became public, and that Bergman was carrying Rossellini's child while still legally married to her first husband, the Swedish dentist Petter Lindström. What followed was a denunciation of ferocity, almost impossible to comprehend. Colorado Senator Edwin C. Johnson took to the Senate floor and condemned Bergman by name, calling her a powerful influence for evil and Hollywood's apostle of degradation. He proposed a formal certificate of moral turpitude to bar her from the country. Churches organized boycotts. Fan mail became hate mail overnight. The Los Angeles Times ran editorials questioning whether her films should be permitted in American theaters at all. The speed with which the nation turned on a woman it had adored was breathtaking, and it happened, it should be noted, entirely without any equivalent response to the men involved in similar situations throughout Hollywood's history. Rossellini faced no Senate denunciation. No churches organized boycotts of his films. The machinery of public condemnation, when it was activated, was aimed entirely at her. But here is what almost no one at the time stopped to ask. What was Bergman supposed to do? She was in Italy. She was in love. She was carrying a child. The Senate had spoken. The churches had organized. The studios had made their calculations. And Ingrid Bergman, the woman who had played Joan of Arc, was entirely alone. What she did next would take 7 years. And the ending was not what anyone expected. The studio machinery responded without public condemnation that would have been unseemly. Instead, she was simply made unwelcome. Premiere circuits, industry events, the entire social infrastructure of Hollywood celebration closed around her through 1,000 small decisions made by people who understood which way the wind was blowing. Bergman spent 7 years in Europe, making films with Rossellini and raising their 3 children. The professional cost was enormous, 7 years removed from Hollywood, at the absolute peak of her career. She later said in interviews that she never regretted the choice itself. What she mourned was the assumption that a choice should have cost so much. She was living proof that a woman could be extraordinary at her work and still be destroyed by the gap between who she actually was and who the industry needed her to appear to be. Her return came with Anastasia in 1956. The following year, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress, with Cary Grant accepting on her behalf. When she appeared at the Academy Awards ceremony in 1959, the industry that had spent a decade making her unwelcome rose to its feet. Those who witnessed it described something beyond ordinary applause, the sound of an institution trying, inadequately and belatedly, to say what it should have said years earlier. Bergman stood in the light and accepted it with the grace that had always been entirely her own. The punishment had exceeded the transgression by any fair measure. Male stars had conducted themselves in precisely the same manner throughout Hollywood's history, without facing a single consequence. The difference was that Bergman had been marketed as a symbol of virtue, and when a symbol fails to conform to requirements, the institution that created it does not examine its own expectations. It destroys the symbol instead. Ingrid Bergman paid 7 years of her professional life for falling in love. That those years were followed by 2 more Academy Awards and a career of extraordinary longevity does not diminish what was taken. It only confirms what she was capable of in spite of it. Dorothy Dandridge, the barrier with a ceiling. There are forms of exclusion so precisely engineered that they become invisible to everyone except the person experiencing them. Dorothy Dandridge encountered one of these forms at the moment of her greatest triumph and spent the rest of her career navigating the precise perimeter of what the industry had decided her achievement was allowed to mean. In 1954, Dandridge received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress for Carmen Jones. She was the first black woman ever to receive that nomination. The magnitude of what this represented in an industry that had spent decades refusing to see black actresses as anything other than supporting figures and exotic curiosities cannot be overstated. Halle Berry, accepting her own Best Actress Oscar in 2002, said directly that she felt Dandridge's hand in hers as she walked to the podium. That is the measure of what Dandridge had done. A door opened nearly 50 years earlier was still being walked through. What no press release mentioned was what happened when she traveled to promote that same film. Hotels along the tour circuit declined to accommodate her, despite the fact that she was the film's star and the face on the poster. On at least one documented occasion, the indignity went further. At a hotel where she was permitted to stay, Dandridge was allowed to use the swimming pool for publicity photographs. When she had finished, the hotel management drained the pool and refilled it before allowing other guests to use it. The woman who had just received an Academy Award nomination was considered, by the establishment that hosted her, to require that particular form of response. Dandridge learned of it. She did not discuss it publicly. Those who knew her during this period described a woman who had learned, very early, that the cost of reacting was borne entirely by her. At industry gatherings, she moved through rooms as a celebrated presence, applauded, admired, pointed out to visitors while being directed, with exquisite politeness, away from certain spaces. Studios that had praised her publicly met with casting directors in private and reached the same conclusion. She could not be paired with white leading men. The calculation was economic in its language and exclusionary in its reality. What Dandridge had broken was real. The ceiling directly above it was equally real, and she encountered it the moment she stood upright. The leading parts in prestige productions that an Oscar-nominated white actress would have received as a professional course did not materialize. She was offered imitations of Carmen Jones films that required her to be precisely what that performance had already defined, in contexts that would never threaten anyone's comfort. There is a telling detail in the correspondence of the period. Casting directors at major studios used language like limited appeal and special market when discussing Dandridge, phrases that translated precisely into a ceiling expressed in the comfortable vocabulary of business. Meanwhile, her white contemporaries who had received nominations in the same year were offered the full range of Hollywood's leading roles. The contrast was not subtle. It was a policy. Dandridge was aware of exactly what was being done. In interviews from the period, she spoke with careful precision about the experience of being celebrated in the abstract and managed in the specific of being told she had broken barriers while watching those same barriers operate around her every single day. She was not naive about her situation. She was simply trapped in it. Her personal life carried its own immense burdens. Her daughter, Marilyn, had been born with severe neurological impairment, requiring care that was both emotionally and financially consuming, a constant pressure that the industry's limited offerings could not relieve. She struggled with dependency on prescribed medications as career offers diminished. The financial foundations that should have supported a career of her caliber simply were not there, because the industry had never built them for her. On September 8, 1965, she was found unresponsive in her West Hollywood apartment, having passed away from an accidental medication overdose. She was 42 years old. The woman who had made history for Hollywood was failed completely by the institution that used her triumph to congratulate itself. We still speak her name. We still watch Carmen Jones. That recognition does not restore what was taken, but it refuses, at least, to let the taking go unacknowledged. Charlie Chaplin, banned while at sea. Of all 11 stories told tonight, only one involves a star literally, formally, and with the full legal authority of a government, prevented from returning to his own premiere. That story belongs to the man who, for 4 decades, had been the most recognized face on Earth. On September 17, 1952, Charlie Chaplin boarded the RMS Queen Elizabeth in New York with his wife Una and their 4 children, traveling to London for the European premiere of Limelight, the most personal film he had ever made, a meditation on age and artistic mortality set against the London music hall world of his own childhood. He told reporters he expected to return in approximately 6 months, with the easy confidence of a man who had lived in the United States for 38 years. One day out of New York, a cable was delivered to him at sea. United States Attorney General James P. McGranery had revoked Chaplin's re-entry permit. To return to the country he had called home since 1914, he would be required to submit to a full hearing examining his political beliefs, his moral character, and his fitness to reside in the United States. The grounds cited were vague in the way that legally constructed persecution usually is references to moral turpitude and associations with communist-aligned organizations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been building a file on Chaplin since the early 1940s. By 1952, that file contained nearly 1,900 pages. What it did not contain was evidence. The FBI had confirmed that Chaplin had never been a member of the Communist Party, had made no significant financial contributions to communist causes, and had broken no law. A 1952 internal memo acknowledged directly that the government had no substantial legal basis to prevent his re-entry. Nevertheless, they proceeded. What made the government's position even more extraordinary was the role played by gossip columnist Hedda Hopper. In the months before Chaplin's departure, Hopper had been writing directly to Senator Richard Nixon, then a senator from California, urging government action against Chaplin, whom she characterized as an undesirable alien whose continued presence in America was an embarrassment to the nation. Her letters, preserved in Nixon's papers, amount to a documented lobbying campaign by a Hollywood insider against one of Hollywood's own. The industry's gossip apparatus had been weaponized against the industry's greatest talent. It is one of the more remarkable ironies in Hollywood history. The woman who made her living, reporting on the film world, had spent months working behind the scenes to destroy the career of the man who had helped build it. In all of Hollywood, the Hollywood Chaplin had helped build 3 people publicly came to his defense. Producer, Samuel Goldwyn. Director, William Wyler. Actor, Cary Grant. 3 people. Chaplin received the cable and made his decision. He would not return to fight a hearing he should never have been required to attend. He surrendered his re-entry permit and settled in Vevey, Switzerland, where he would spend the remaining 25 years of his life. Limelight premiered in London, while its creator watched from the other side of a government's decision. There is a particular sadness in the film's themes. It is the story of a faded music hall comedian, past his prime, wondering whether he has anything left to give, viewed against the knowledge that the man who made it would spend the rest of his life in exile from the country where his legend had been built. Chaplin had made a film about an artist facing obsolescence and then been made obsolete by his own government. The parallel was too precise to be accidental. It felt as though he had known, in some part of himself, what was coming. 20 years later, in 1972, the Academy invited Chaplin back to receive an honorary Oscar. He was 82 years old, small, white-haired, and moving carefully when he walked onto the stage of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion for the first time in 2 decades. The industry that had allowed a government to exile him without raising a meaningful voice in his defense rose to its feet and did not sit down again for 12 minutes. 12 minutes, the longest standing ovation in the history of the Academy Awards ceremony. Those in the room described a particular quality to the applause, something beyond celebration, something with the texture of shame being converted, inadequately, into sound. Chaplin stood at the podium and accepted it. He did not give a speech. He simply stood there, holding the statuette, while Hollywood tried to find a way, with its hands, to say what it had not said when it mattered. He returned to Switzerland, where he passed away on Christmas morning of 1977. The man who had given the world The Little Tramp, who had made every nation on earth feel that the cinema understood them, was denied the right to attend his own premiere by a country that had every reason to be grateful, chose, instead, to be afraid. If you are finding these stories as moving as we do in telling them, please consider subscribing to Golden Age Files. Every week we return to the era that built the movies and tell the stories the studios never wanted to tell. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. Fatty Arbuckle acquitted. destroyed anyway. Charlie Chaplin was exiled by a government that at least had the procedural honesty to issue a formal order. What happened to Roscoe Arbuckle required no order, no legal mechanism, and no evidence. It required only the decision of an industry to act as though a jury's verdict was a suggestion rather than a conclusion. In 1921, Arbuckle was one of the most beloved figures in American entertainment. Physical, precise, and surprisingly gentle in his comedic gifts, among the first performers to earn $1 million annual salary from a film studio. He had given a young Buster Keaton his first significant break, mentoring him with a generosity that Keaton described as transformative and spoke of with gratitude for the rest of his life. People who worked with Arbuckle described the same quality, consistently a warmth that was genuine rather than performed. A man who was, in private, precisely as kind as his screen persona suggested. Audiences adored him. They were right to. Labor Day weekend, 1921. A gathering at the Hotel St. Francis in San Francisco. The subsequent collapse and passing of a young actress named Virginia Rappe. And then, the press. The coverage transformed Arbuckle within days from a beloved national figure into something the newspapers had decided to make of him. William Randolph Hearst, the same press magnate who would later work to destroy Orson Welles, reportedly saw in the Arbuckle story an opportunity to sell newspapers, and his publications pursued it with a ferocity that had little interest in what the evidence actually showed. The specific accusations bore an increasingly distant relationship to what witnesses reported, but the damage was accomplished with the speed that only a coordinated press campaign can achieve. And by the time legal proceedings began, public opinion had already delivered its verdict. 3 trials followed. The first ended with a hung jury. The second ended with a hung jury. The third ended with an acquittal, and with something rarer still. The jury issued a written statement saying, formally and for the record, that Roscoe Arbuckle had been the victim of a grave injustice, that the evidence demonstrated his complete innocence, and that they wished to offer him a sincere apology. It meant nothing. Will Hayes, the newly appointed head of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, banned Arbuckle from the screen, regardless of the acquittal. His completed films were pulled from release. His name was removed from credits already printed on promotional materials. The works he had made, the performances he had given, all of it confiscated from public view by an industry that had decided a jury's unanimous verdict was less authoritative than a newspaper's front page. For years, Arbuckle worked as a director under the pseudonym William Goodrich because even the right to attach his own name to his work had been taken from him. Those who worked with him described a man who approached every project with professionalism and dignity, though the personal cost of what had been done was visible to anyone paying attention. Buster Keaton, who remained fiercely loyal to Arbuckle throughout the entire ordeal, visited him regularly and later said that the man he found in those years was diminished in a way that no legal vindication had been able to repair. The joy that had made him extraordinary had been methodically extinguished. What history records, and what deserves to be said plainly, is that Roscoe Arbuckle was the victim of a legal system that was supposed to protect him and a press apparatus that had no interest in doing so. The acquittal was real, the jury's apology was real, and the industry's decision to treat both of those things as irrelevant tells you more about what Hollywood actually valued: its image above all else. Always its image above all else than almost any other story in this video. Permission to perform under his own name was eventually, grudgingly restored. In June of 1933, Arbuckle signed a new performing contract. That night, he passed away in his sleep from a cardiac event. He was 46 years old. The jury had said innocent. Hollywood had said otherwise. And in the history of the studio system's power to shape reality, no verdict was ever more completely overruled. The only reasonable word for what was done to Roscoe Arbuckle is injustice. It was committed in plain sight, without apology, by people who understood exactly what they were doing. Buster Keaton, the genius, they dismantled. Fatty Arbuckle's destruction was loud and public. What happened to Buster Keaton was inflicted more quietly inside the walls of the studio that was supposed to protect him, accomplished gradually, systematically, and with the smiling efficiency of people who called it help. In 1928, Keaton was at a creative peak. Very few figures in cinema history have achieved. The General, Sherlock Jr., Steamboat Bill Jr., films of such physical imagination and emotional precision that they remain, nearly a century later, among the most studied works in the medium. He had never made a film that failed. He had never approached a project without total commitment and total creative control. What made Keaton's films extraordinary was not simply his physical daring, though that was real and extraordinary. A man who repeatedly put himself at great personal risk for a joke. It was the quality of melancholy underneath the comedy. The Great Stone Face, audiences called him, because he never smiled. But those who watched carefully saw in that stillness something more complex than a performance. They saw a man who understood, at some fundamental level, that the world was genuinely dangerous and absurd, and that the most honest response was to face it without flinching. Charlie Chaplin warned him. Harold Lloyd warned him. Chaplin's words, as Keaton later recalled them, were direct. Don't do it. They'll ruin your helping you. They'll warp your judgment. You'll get tired of arguing for things you know are right. Keaton listened, found no viable alternatives, and signed with MGM anyway. He later called it the worst mistake of his life. The studio banned him immediately from performing his own physical work on screen, the very thing that made his comedy transcendent. The elaborate, precisely engineered sequences that had defined his genius required him to commit his actual body to the joke in a way the camera could not fake, and audiences could feel without being able to explain why. MGM considered this an insurance liability. Keaton understood, from this single decision, exactly what was coming. There is documentary footage from this period Keaton, on a soundstage, surrounded by producers, writers, and directors assigned by the studio, all of them telling him what to do. He sits between takes with that famous expressionless face, and people who knew him well said that in those moments, the stillness was not composure. It was the silence of a man who had been told, in 100 ways, that the thing that made him exceptional was the thing they needed him to stop doing. He obeyed, and something irreplaceable left the room. Writers were assigned who did not understand silence. Directors were designated who did not understand pace. Storylines were selected by committee. Each film was worse than the one before, and as they declined, Keaton began to drink with a seriousness that alarmed those around him. By 1933, MGM let him go. Louis B. Mayer informed him personally that his services were no longer required. Keaton was briefly institutionalized during the period that followed. He declared bankruptcy. Those who encountered him during these years described a man who had not stopped being funny. The instincts were still there, the timing still precise, but who had simply run out of places to put the gift. The studio had not destroyed his talent. It had destroyed his belief that the talent had anywhere left to go. He rebuilt slowly through television appearances and the gradual rediscovery of his silent films by a new generation who encountered the General and Sherlock Jr. without MGM's interference and understood immediately what they were looking at. The film historian James Agee wrote an essay in the early 1950s calling Keaton one of the greatest artists who ever lived, and a new generation of filmmakers began circulating his films among themselves. Directors like Federico Fellini and Orson Welles, who had his own complicated relationship with institutional power, cited Keaton as a foundational influence. The world had caught up with him. The studio that had broken him had simply arrived too early to understand what it had. In 1959, the Academy awarded him an honorary Oscar. He received it with the same stone-faced composure that had made him famous, though those who knew him reported that beneath that famous stillness, he was genuinely moved. Buster Keaton had the last laugh. It simply took 30 years to arrive. Olivia de Havilland, the woman who sued for her freedom. Not every star who fought the studio system lost. One woman not only fought, she won. And what she won changed Hollywood forever. Olivia de Havilland understood precisely what she possessed and chose to fight for it in a court of law. The studio's response was to ensure that fighting cost her everything she had built. In 1939, she played Melanie Hamilton Wilkes in Gone with the Wind, a performance of such warmth and moral clarity that it earned her first Academy Award nomination. She had fought for that role over Warner Brothers' resistance, because she recognized it as the kind of work she was capable of, and the studio was not offering her. By 1943, her 7-year contract had run its legal course. De Havilland informed Warner Brothers. She considered herself a free agent. The studio informed her she was mistaken. The suspensions she had served periods during which the studio had withheld her salary as punishment for refusing roles she found beneath her abilities had paused the clock. She owed them 6 additional months, minimum. Most contracted players accepted this without legal challenge. Bette Davis had challenged Warner Brothers in the 1930s and lost, returning to Hollywood in debt and with a reputation for difficulty. De Havilland challenged them anyway. On August 23, 1943, her attorneys filed suit against Warner Brothers, arguing that California labor law prohibited the enforcement of personal services contracts beyond 7 calendar years from the date of commencement. Suspensions included. Warner Brothers responded by circulating a letter to every other major studio in Hollywood. The effect, documented in legal proceedings, was a comprehensive industry blacklist. She did not appear in a single film for nearly 2 years during what should have been the most productive period of her career. The studios that received the letter understood its meaning without requiring a more explicit instruction. She was 37 years old, at the height of her abilities, and effectively invisible in the industry she had helped define. What is remarkable about De Havilland's position during those 2 years is not merely that she endured the blacklist, but that she did so without capitulating. Other stars who had been suspended or managed by studios had eventually made their peace with the system, accepting roles they found beneath them, performing gratitude they did not feel, returning to the machinery on the machinery's terms. De Havilland did not. She maintained her legal challenge through months of uncertainty, without income from film work, without any guarantee that the court would rule in her favor, facing the very real possibility that she might win the principle and lose her career permanently. She understood that what she was fighting was larger than her own contract. She was fighting a system that treated human beings as property, and she intended to win. She won. The California Court of Appeal ruled unanimously in her favor on December 8, 1944. The decision, now known as the De Havilland Law, still part of California Labor Code today, established that 7 calendar years meant 7 calendar years, and that the studios had been operating outside the law. The judge described the contract structure Warner Brothers had been enforcing as a form of involuntary servitude. Warner Brothers, the studio that had circulated that letter, ensured she could not work anywhere in Hollywood for nearly 2 years, described her as their property in open court, watched her walk to the Academy Award podium in 1946 and again in 1950, both times accepting the industry's highest honor. Both times working for studios no longer permitted them to treat her as they once had. She had not merely won her case. She had changed the conditions of everyone who came after her. Every actor who has worked in California under a fair contract since 1944 owes something to the decision she made in 1943. It cost her 2 years of her career. She gave those 2 years and took back a law. That seems, by any measure, a worthy exchange. Orson Welles, the masterpiece that ended its maker. Olivia de Havilland was punished for challenging the studio system from within. Orson Welles was targeted from outside by someone considerably more powerful than any studio head, a man who owned the newspapers that shaped public opinion, and who had decided that Citizen Kane was too honest about what men like him did to the people around them. To understand what was done to Welles, you first need to understand what he made. Citizen Kane, completed in 1941, by a 25-year-old who had never directed a feature film, represents one of those rare moments when a single work changes the possibilities of an entire medium. Its use of deep focus photography, non-linear narrative, and unconventional camera angles gave filmmakers a new vocabulary that simply had not existed before. Roger Ebert called it the work of a young man who had gone directly from genius to masterpiece, without the usual apprenticeship in between. That is the film William Randolph Hearst decided must be stopped before it could be seen. Hearst recognized himself in Charles Foster Kane, a newspaper magnate whose public power masked a private life of emptiness and lovelessness, and the parallels were not subtle. Kane's accumulation of power, his failed marriages, his vast estate filled with possessions that could not compensate for the love he had lost. Hearst saw all of it and understood exactly what Welles had done. What followed was a campaign of institutional pressure the Hollywood community met with capitulation. Hearst's newspapers refused advertising for the film. theater owners were quietly made aware of the risks of screening it. Louis B. Mayer reportedly offered RKO the full cost of the negative to have it removed from circulation before release. RKO declined, but the premiere circuit and industry celebrations that should have accompanied a film of its caliber were conducted under a cloud of institutional anxiety. Citizen Kane received 9 Academy Award nominations. It won 1 Best Original Screenplay. Welles later described the ceremony as a sustained exercise in public humiliation. The message was clear. The industry would not fully honor a film that had made the wrong enemy. Welles spent most of his subsequent career in Europe, financing independent projects by acting in other directors' films. The Magnificent Ambersons, his second film, was taken from him by RKO and recut without his involvement. 24 minutes removed, the original ending replaced. The version Welles made was never seen. He kept making films that demonstrated his genius had not diminished Othello, completed after years of interrupted production funded from his own acting work. Touch of Evil, a crime picture of such visual invention that even its detractors acknowledged its brilliance, then taken from him and recut without his knowledge. Chimes at Midnight, which many scholars consider his finest achievement, made in Spain on a fraction of what any Hollywood studio would have spent, and largely ignored on its release. Each film was a fight. Each fight was conducted without the resources the work deserved, and the industry that had built him watched from a distance and declined to intervene. There is a recorded interview from the 1970s in which a French journalist asks Welles whether he is bitter about what Hollywood did to his career. Welles pauses for a long moment and then says, carefully, that bitterness would require him to believe things should have been otherwise, and that he had learned not to make that mistake. It is one of the most controlled responses in the history of recorded interviews. A man who had spent 30 years watching his genius be systematically denied the resources it required, declining to give his interlocutor the satisfaction of seeing what that had cost him. Those who knew him well said the control was real, but incomplete. He was bitter. He had simply decided that the bitterness belonged to him alone. He passed away in October of 1985. On the same day, he completed narration for a documentary project, having spent his final years working on a film called The Other Side of the Wind that remained unfinished. It was eventually completed and released by others in 2018, 33 years after his passing. The man who had changed cinema at 25 spent his final decades searching for the resources to do it again, finding them always just beyond his reach, in an industry that admired what he had accomplished and consistently declined to help him accomplish more. Citizen Kane is ranked among the greatest films ever produced. Hollywood celebrated the work. It never found a way to fully honor the man who made it. Rita Hayworth, the love goddess, who was never allowed to be free. Orson Welles was punished for making a film that exposed what power does to the people around it. Rita Hayworth was punished for something more intimate, for being the most valuable thing a studio owned, and for refusing, with quiet consistency, to accept that the word owned applied to her. She was born Margarita Carmen Cancino in Brooklyn in 1918, the daughter of a Spanish dancer and an Irish-American showgirl. She began performing as a child and was signed to her first studio contract at 15. By the time Columbia Pictures president Harry Cohn encountered her in the late 1930s, she was already a performer of considerable discipline and natural screen presence. Cohn saw something he wanted. He also saw something he intended to control. The transformation he oversaw was comprehensive. Her surname became Hayworth. Her naturally dark hairline was raised through painful electrolysis treatments. Her hair was dyed auburn. Her speaking voice was coached. By the time this process was complete, the woman who appeared on screen bore a carefully engineered relationship to the woman who had walked into Cohn's office. The woman who had been Margarita Cancino, the daughter of a Spanish dancer, a girl who had performed in border town casinos as a teenager alongside her own father, had been systematically replaced by a construction that better suited Columbia's commercial requirements. Through the 1940s, Hayworth became Columbia's most important commercial asset, the performer whose films kept the studio financially viable during the war years, whose image appeared on the covers of Life magazine 4 times, whose name above a title was as close to a guarantee as the business offered. Harry Cohn called her the 4th most valuable property in the business. He said it without apparent awareness of how much that phrasing revealed. What audiences did not know was that behind the glamorous image, Cohn was conducting a campaign of documented surveillance and intimidation. Her dressing room was bugged. Financial penalties were imposed for insubordination. He repeatedly pressured her for personal favors. She refused, a pattern documented extensively in her biography and confirmed by multiple accounts. He expressed his displeasure through the 1,000 small mechanisms available to a man who controlled everything about her professional life. When Hayworth married Prince Ali Khan in 1949, Cohn's methodical response began immediately grooming her replacement at the studio. When she returned to Columbia in the early 1950s, she found the terms of her homecoming dictated entirely by the man who had treated her career as a personal possession. At the peak of her wartime fame, the United States military decorated an atomic bomb with her photograph from the June 1946 issue of Esquire and stenciled the word Gilda across its surface. When Hayworth learned of it, she wanted to hold a press conference. Cohn refused, telling her it would be unpatriotic. The most intimate possible appropriation of her image had been made without her knowledge or consent, and when she wished to respond, the man who controlled her professional life told her she was not permitted. The woman who had been remade from the outside in, whose very name and hairline and speaking voice had been altered to suit someone else's requirements, was not permitted to have a public opinion about the use of her own face on a weapon capable of causing tremendous devastation. She sued Columbia in 1955 to be released from her contract. In 1970, long after Cohn's passing, she told the New York Times that she had come back to Columbia because she wanted to work, and that finishing that contract was precisely how Harry Cohn had owned her. Orson Welles, who had been briefly married to Hayworth in the 1940s and understood her situation better than most, said in a later interview that Rita was the most natural actress he had ever worked with, and that what Cohn did to her career was a form of vandalism, the deliberate diminishment of something valuable, because the person doing the Cohn diminishing could. Welles was not a man given to understatement. When he used the word vandalism, he meant it precisely. In her final years, Hayworth was affected by early-onset Alzheimer's disease, a condition that went undiagnosed for approximately 2 decades and was frequently mischaracterized as excessive drinking, compounding the injustice of how she was perceived. Her daughter, Yasmin Khan, cared for her with devotion. She passed away in New York City in May of 1987, at the age of 68. Columbia had made fortunes from her face, her name, her talent, and her image, including, extraordinarily, from an image placed on a weapon without her permission. It never gave her what she was worth. We want to pause here for a moment, because these stories belong to you as much as they belong to history. Which of these revelations has stayed with you tonight? Leave us your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us what Golden Age Hollywood story you would like us to tell next. Your suggestions shape this channel, and we read every one of them. Gloria Swanson. The film Hollywood couldn't forgive itself. Rita Hayworth fought Harry Cohn as a woman fighting a man. Gloria Swanson fought something larger, an entire industry that had recognized itself in a film she made, and had decided that recognizing itself was exactly the kind of thing it was not prepared to reward. Her story begins with perhaps the greatest performance any actress gave in the 1950s, and it ends with an industry that could not look at that performance without seeing its own reflection and looking away. In 1950, Swanson returned to the screen after years of semi-retirement to play Norma Desmond in Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard, a faded, silent film actress living in a crumbling mansion, sustained by grandiose delusions of an imminent, triumphant return to stardom. The performance was recognized immediately as one of the most demanding and completely realized in the history of American cinema. What made it extraordinary was not merely technical accomplishment. It was the quality of honest self-awareness she brought to a character who had none, playing Norma Desmond's delusion from the inside, while somehow allowing the audience to see both what Norma believed and what was actually true. It was the kind of performance that requires a performer to draw on something real, on a genuine understanding of what it means to have been celebrated and then set aside. Swanson understood this from the inside. She had been one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood during the silent era. a woman of such commercial importance that she had been carried to her dressing room in a sedan chair by studio employees. And then sound arrived, and the industry moved on, and Swanson spent 20 years watching Hollywood celebrate people who had learned from the films she had made. When Billy Wilder cast her in Sunset Boulevard, he was not asking her to imagine what it felt like to be a forgotten star. He was asking her to remember. She later said that she had not needed to act very hard in that role. She needed only to be honest. Paramount arranged a private screening for studio heads and invited guests. Barbara Stanwyck reportedly knelt and kissed the hem of Swanson's gown when the lights came up. And then Louis B. Mayer stood before the assembled crowd and berated director Billy Wilder with a ferocity that shocked even that seasoned company, telling him he had disgraced the industry, that he should be driven out of Hollywood, that the film was a betrayal of everything the movies stood for. What Mayer understood was that Sunset Boulevard was not merely a film about a faded actress. It was a film about what Hollywood did to its stars, the industry's capacity to build entire empires from a performer's talent and image, then discard them the moment their commercial moment had passed. Without acknowledgement, without gratitude, without the basic recognition that a debt had been incurred and remained unpaid. Norma Desmond was not merely a character. She was an indictment, and every powerful man in that screening room knew it. The irony that escaped no one who was paying attention was that Swanson herself was living proof of the film's thesis. Here was a woman who had been one of the most powerful figures in silent Hollywood, now sitting in a screening room watching powerful men react with fury to a film that told her story, while those same men prepared to deny the film the recognition it deserved. Life and art had collapsed into a single devastating point. Sunset Boulevard received 11 Academy Award nominations. It won 3 for Best Screenplay, Best Art Direction, and Best Score. Swanson lost Best Actress to Judy Holliday. Wilder lost Best Director to Joseph L. Mankiewicz. The film that most honestly depicted what Hollywood did to its women walked away with its major categories unfulfilled. The film offers that came to Swanson afterward were almost without exception variations on Norma Desmond, the industry's way of keeping her in a category it could manage. She turned most of them down. She painted, sculpted, designed clothing, championed nutritional health, gave interviews of remarkable intelligence and wit, and lived with a vitality that made clear how completely wrong the industry's assessment of her had been. She passed away in April of 1983, at the age of 84. Sunset Boulevard has outlasted every film that defeated it that night. The performance the Academy declined to honor is studied in film schools on every continent. Gloria Swanson was right about what the film was. The industry was wrong about what it deserved. The intervening decades have made that clear with a thoroughness that no acceptance speech could have achieved. Marilyn Monroe, The Last Year. She was 35 years old. She was the most photographed woman in the world. And on the evening of May 19, 1962, she was preparing to sing Happy Birthday to the President of the United States in a dress sewn directly onto her body, 4,500 rhinestones on a sheer fabric, so fine that the costume designer described it as wearing nothing at all. Marilyn Monroe walked to the microphone at Madison Square Garden that night before 15,000 people and compressed her entire mythology, the vulnerability, the radiance, the specific quality of presence that made every other person in the room feel, inexplicably, that she was looking directly at them into approximately 4 minutes. It was the last great public performance of her life. 6 weeks later, 20th Century Fox let her go. The studio cited chronic absences from Something's Got to Give, a film troubled from its inception by script problems, directorial changes, and scheduling complications that extended well beyond Monroe's involvement. The announcement was made with a specificity of blame that served the studio's narrative efficiently. What the studio did not announce was that the footage Monroe had already completed had generated international press coverage studios dream about. The swimming pool sequence had produced front-page coverage in publications across the world. Director George Cukor, who had worked with Monroe on the film before being replaced, later said privately that what he had seen of her performance before production collapsed was some of the most naturally charismatic work he had witnessed in 40 years of directing. The studio let her go anyway. The studio used her image in promotional materials for the film's anticipated release. It used her name in discussions with theater owners. It used the press coverage generated by her work while publicly characterizing her as unreliable and irresponsible. She had taken her craft seriously enough to study at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, to deliver performances in Some Like It Hot and Bus Stop and The Misfits that demonstrated a comic and dramatic intelligence far exceeding what the studio's publicity materials had ever chosen to acknowledge. Lee Strasberg himself, who had trained performers of the caliber of Marlon Brando and James Dean, said that Monroe was one of the two greatest talents he had ever worked with. The studio had made enormous profits from that talent for more than a decade. Now it was using her image to promote a film she had been removed from. Behind the scenes, Fox's legal team was quietly preparing documentation to reinstate her contract. She was, as the studio had always known, too valuable to actually discard. The calculation was simply being performed again. What was Monroe worth? And what was she costing? And how could those figures be brought into alignment? She was aware negotiations were ongoing. Those close to her during this period described a woman who was exhausted not by the work itself, which she still loved, but by the perpetual experience of being valued enormously as an image and regarded as a problem as a person. She had said as much in interviews that men fell in love with the character and woke up confused when they found her instead. On the morning of August 5, 1962, Monroe was found unresponsive at her home in Brentwood, California, having passed away from an accidental barbiturate overdose. She was 36 years old. The studio expressed its grief publicly and efficiently. Fox reinstated nothing. The films already in the catalog continued generating revenue. The Monroe mythology proved to be perhaps the most durable commercial asset in Hollywood's history, worth more in the decades that followed than anything the studio had paid for it. She had given the studio 15 years of her talent, her image, and the specific quality of presence that no contract could have predicted and no publicity department could have manufactured. The studio gave her a contract, a dismissal, and approximately 6 weeks that she did not have. She deserved immeasurably more than that. The fact that we are still saying her name, still watching her films, still feeling the irreplaceable quality of what she brought to every scene she ever appeared in, is the only justice the situation permits. It is not enough, but it is what we have, and it refuses, at least, to let the taking go without being named. The studio system built the most glamorous dream factory the world has ever seen. It produced films that will be watched as long as human beings need stories. And it did all of this by treating the extraordinary human beings at its center as assets to be managed, controlled, and discarded stars, who gave everything, every last piece of themselves, and were given in return exactly as much as the system calculated it needed to provide. What the system never understood, what it was constitutionally incapable of understanding, was that you cannot manufacture what these people had. You can change a name, you can raise a hairline, you can revoke a permit, circulate a letter, let a woman go on a Tuesday. You can do all of it, and the thing you are trying to control will still be there in every frame, in every gesture, in the specific quality of light that falls on a face that trusted the camera completely, because the camera was sometimes the only thing that asked nothing in return. What survived is Grace Kelly's hands folded in her lap as she plays a woman trying not to feel too much. It is Chaplin standing with his little cane, making the whole world laugh at something that was never actually funny. It is Marilyn, at a microphone, in a dress sewn onto her body, singing to a president in a room full of thousands alone in the way that only the truly famous ever are, and somehow, impossibly, incandescent, they paid for those moments. Every one of them paid. And we have been watching ever since, feeling something we cannot entirely name because what we are feeling is the truth of another person bleeding through the screen. Watch their films again. Watch them knowing what you now know. And if you feel something catch in your throat this time that wasn't there before, that is you finally understanding the full price of what you are watching. Honor it. They earned it. If tonight has moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves classic Hollywood as much as you do. Every share carries these stories a little further into the world, where they belong. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Golden Age Files, now is the moment, because next week we return to the era that built the movies, and we will bring you stories every bit as extraordinary as the ones we told tonight. Until then, this is the Golden Age Files. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for remembering.